The UK national debt is around 100% of GDP. That's 1 year's output is already borrowed. And as we go past 100%, as we almost inevitably will, the burden on current taxpayers to pay just the interest on the debt, but also the burden on future generations to pay it back, goes up and up. There's no free lunch here. There's no get out of jail card by sticking it on the credit account rather than paying our way, paying as we go. Now, the fiscal rules about which the government makes a great fanfare say that we should stop borrowing to pay for current spending by 2030. Now, let's be clear what that means. That means we're going to go on borrowing to pay for current spending, all that welfare, health and other costs, until 2030. It's only by 2030 we're going to achieve this outcome. And of course, and this is crucial, the rules don't apply to investment. So in principle, you can borrow as much as you like, providing what you're borrowing for is investment, not current consumption. Indeed, there are so many things in the British economy that need doing. Look at the state of the infrastructures, the kind of reflection in reality of the notion that everything's broken. Well, a lot of stuff is broken, and there's a lot that needs doing. So why not borrow billions, trillions, indeed, and put all this stuff right? Because it's investment, it's not consumption, so it doesn't matter in the fiscal framework. That's not to say we shouldn't do some of this stuff. It's simply to say it's completely open-ended. And that raises a really quite substantive issue, and one of the ways in which the books, and particularly the borrowing numbers, are being fiddled. Because you can see the incentive to a politician confronted with backbenchers who want more and more welfare spending, more and more health spending, more and more social care spending, backbenchers who were put in Parliament to support just these things. That's what they're there to do. That's what they think they're there to do. And, hey, we need to try to get as much of that done, they may think. And this is how the fiddle goes. What you do is you call almost any current expenditure you can investment. Gordon Brown tried it some time ago when he reclassified education and health spending as essentially contributing to what he called, or Ed Balls called, endogenous growth. It was investment in the health of the population, investment in human capital through education. And there's a sense in which part of that argument is right. But you can see how it will appeal to politicians pretending to be pursuing fiscal virtue. Just shove it across into the investment category, then the fiscal rules don't apply and off you go. But there's another one of the ways in which these fiddles can be done, which is endemic, and not just to this government, by the way, and that is to call capital maintenance investment. What we should be doing with our core infrastructures in the public and the private sector is properly maintaining them so that they don't decline and that we pass on to each successive generation a set of assets at least as good as we inherited. It's not investment to fix the leaks in the water pipes. It's not investment to fix crumbling bridges. It's capital maintenance. And capital maintenance should be current spending, not capital spending. So here we have two ways of fiddling the books and passing the costs across. First of all, what you do is you just relabel stuff investment. And then secondly, within that category, you take capital maintenance and shove it across into the investment criteria. Then, hey, we can spend as much as we like. And indeed, the ONS supports this kind of move by defining capital maintenance as anything which has an asset life of less than 12 months. Well, just think about that. That gives you enormous scope. And indeed, even at the margin, you might fiddle it further by trying to make sure that anything you do which had, say, 10 months life, you make it 13 months so you can move it across the category. And I must stress, these numbers really matter because they're the difference between fiscal rules that bite and fiscal rules that don't. You can have a good argument about whether the fiscal rules are sensible, but it's very dangerous to keep professing that you're going to follow the rules and then essentially fiddle the numbers underneath. Now, you might think that's bad enough in the sense of presenting the real state of the British economy and its finances, but this is only the direct public accounting fiddles that are available. There's a much bigger fiddle that's been taking place, and it was enabled by privatisation. And all successive governments have protested their innocence about pursuing the privatisation of public expenditure, but all of them have been in the game. And this government's no different. We're about to see a wall of what are effectively private finance initiatives, PFIs, to get stuff off the state balance sheet, put it on the private balance sheets, and then pretend that the net indebtedness of the economy has not gone up as a result. And how do you do this? Well, if we think about all the things that used to be on the public accounts, the whole of the CGB and the investments in the power sector, all that period from the late 1940s to the mid-70s in which the economy grew at 3% per year and electricity demand increased at 7%, all those coal power stations built, all those nuclear power stations, all the expansion of the grid, all of that was on the public books. So too were the reservoirs, the sewers and the water pipes. So too, of course, was the railways, and so too was British telecoms and the Royal Mail. All on the public accounts, so that if you look at the numbers for public borrowing and public spending in those periods, these were included. And when you look at anything after about 1990, most of this lot is excluded. And that's a sleight of the accountancy hand, not a fundamental change in the financial position of the government. So this move leads us to the delusion that we are able to hold our borrowing at, now 100% of GDP, whereas if you added back all the borrowing that's taken place in the private sector, in these utilities and in these PFI projects, etc., the number will be very different. Now, of course, it's reasonable to say, yes, but the customers and not the taxpayers are on the hook for this borrowing by all these privatised activities that have got off the public balance sheet. True. But, there isn't that much difference between customers and taxpayers, except the customer's base is more regressive than the taxpayer's base. We're all in this together. We're all part of UK PLC, and we're all in paying our utility bills, paying it to companies, almost all of whom are effectively now foreign owned. We're paying it to them in a form that is part of our everyday constraints and against the background of the public guarantee that the regulators will ensure that these companies can finance their functions. And just in case you think this really isn't anything to do with the state and therefore it's perfectly possible to get this stuff off the balance sheet, and, why don't we privatise a lot more to get it off the balance sheet, and then we probably could pretend that we're only at 100% debt to GDP. Unless you think that that's the kind of framework that we are going to take forward, you have to realise that there are lots of contingent liabilities out there. So, just take a look at Thames Water. The government effectively, and indeed for the other water companies, is taking back control of the water industry. John Cunliffe, in his latest interim report, suggests we should supervise the utilities in the water sector. So we're going to determine their dividends, we're going to determine their investment, we're going to determine the performance of their management. The government's, through the regulator, going to take over the effective functions of the boards of these companies. Don't think that that means that there aren't consequences for the expectation of voters that the public will stand behind them and make sure that the bills are kept low. Well, That's not a good place to go, given the scale of the infrastructure spend going forward. Years ago, when privatisation got going, I wrote about what I called the private sector borrowing requirement as opposed to the public sector borrowing requirement, pointed out this sleight of accounting wizardry and suggested that the true fiscal position of the economy should be adding the public sector borrowing requirement, as it was then called, and the private sector borrowing requirement to get the overall borrowing of the economy. And just to add a final twist, this matters not just because we should know how much we're borrowing and how much we're lumbering the next generation with paying for stuff like what should be called capital maintenance. Just remember too, all of this stuff is now coming at a much higher cost of capital to the government and to the private sector. The real interest rate's gone up. The UK has experienced a dramatic increase in its long rates of borrowing. So much it's now having to switch to short-term borrowing for fear of the long-run costs going forward. And all this means that the scale of the burden that this debt implies on us now, and especially on future generations, is much greater than is currently reported. What we need is honesty in public finance, and in particular, we need an account which shows just how far we are living beyond our means. Don't expect the Chancellor to explain all that lot as she looks at spending over the next few years and looks into the next attempt to try to patch up the books after all this fiddling in the autumn. Thank you.